Are you a new or returning PC builder who's confused about how to build a PC in 2022? Hi, welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. 2022 is proving to be a great time to build a PC. This video is going to give you a broad overview of what each PC component is, what to think about when buying it, and how it all connects together. We'll also give tips on specific areas like the best gaming PC parts and the best video editing PC parts. And we'll review what parts to buy first to get you started on your best PC build 2022 journey. Of course, that's what this channel is all about. It's about getting you the best price to performance in your PC. If you get value out of the video, please give it a like. It really helps out the channel. And of course, subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. With that, let's jump into it. Let's kick off our PC Parts Explained for beginners and returning builders with one of the most important decisions you're going to make, and that is the Central Processing Unit, or CPU. Now, there are two major CPU makers, AMD and Intel. They make a variety of CPUs, but today we're just focusing on the consumer desktop market. The CPU connects into the motherboard and is the brain of the computer, but the CPU itself has more than one brain it can use at a time, called a core. Most modern processors are at least 4 cores and come in 6, 8, 10, 12, and even 16 core versions. The more cores, the more the CPU can do at once, though some tasks like gaming only need between 4 and 8 cores depending on the game and how powerful the CPU is. Most AMD and Intel CPUs have cores that can do up to 2 tasks at the same time, something we call multi-threading. So when I say the AMD Ryzen 5 5600 has 6 cores and 12 threads, that means it has 6 cores that can each do roughly 2 things at the same time. Note that with Intel's 12th generation CPUs, they've introduced a big little design with big cores that they call performance cores, which can multi-thread, and smaller cores, which they call efficiency cores, that are single-threaded. So the Intel i5-12600K has 6 performance cores that can each multi-thread, and 4 efficiency cores that are single-threaded for a total of 10 cores and 16 threads. The most currently relevant AMD CPUs are the Ryzen 5000 CPUs, the Ryzen 4000 CPUs, and the preceding Ryzen 3000 line. For Intel, their most recent CPUs include the 12th generation CPUs, as well as both the 11th and 10th generation CPUs. We do expect the Ryzen 7000 CPUs and Intel 13th generation CPUs to be launched later in 2022. All AMD CPUs are unlocked, meaning you can overclock them if you want to, and you can also overclock the memory with them. Intel CPUs labeled with a K in the name can also be overclocked, but only on a compatible Z series motherboard. More on that later. But none of the other Intel CPUs can be overclocked. However, the memory can be overclocked on a compatible Z series motherboard for any of the Intel CPU generations, a B560 motherboard for Intel 10th and 11th generation CPUs, or a B660 motherboard if using a 12th generation CPU. So what's an APU? Some CPUs come with integrated graphics like all the Intel CPUs that do not have an F in their name, and the AMD CPUs that do have a G in their name, like the Ryzen 5600G. Integrated graphics mean that you can get a video signal without a dedicated graphics card, more on those in a second. For most gaming or creative work though, like video editing, you're gonna want a dedicated graphics card, but for basic office builds or ultra budget gaming builds, you can consider an APU. For more on that, check out our Ryzen 5600G gaming build on the channel. Of course, if you want the best PC build 2022, especially the best gaming PC build 2022, then you need a graphics processing unit, usually called the GPU, and sometimes called the graphics card or video card. Currently, as I'm filming this, we are coming out of a very long shortage of GPUs. Now, we do a monthly GPU market update on the channel if you want to learn more about the current state of the GPU market. But the good news is that the GPU pricing and availability have massively improved since January 2022, and we expect it to continue to improve and normalize throughout the year. A dedicated graphics card plugs into the motherboard, and you can use the outputs on the back of the card rather than the motherboard to get the video signal out. Graphics cards are primarily made by AMD and NVIDIA. However, Intel is going to launch its own lineup of graphics cards beginning in summer 2022. As it stands now, AMD and NVIDIA are both excellent gaming graphics cards, but NVIDIA still has a slight edge for productivity features like video encoding for video editing work, although AMD is catching up. The current relevant GPUs include NVIDIA's RTX 3000 series, the RTX 2060, GTX 1660, and 1650 series. Currently relevant AMD GPUs include the RX 6000 series. Of course, older GPUs will also work on any current build if you want to buy one off of a used seller. How powerful a graphics card you have and the types of games that you want to play are going to determine what monitor resolution you can use and how many frames per second, called FPS, you can get, along with the type of monitor that you buy. I go over a lot more on that in my Best Gaming Monitors 2022 guide, so I'll leave a link to that down in the video description below. In a normal GPU market, the GPU is typically the easiest, but also the most expensive component to upgrade in the future, as it just requires taking the old one out and putting in the new one. Though you may need a larger power supply if you jump way up in overall GPU power with your upgrade. So what's the right CPU and GPU combo for you? Well, it really depends on what you're doing. Now for gaming, you want the best GPU that you can buy, and a CPU that's not going to bottleneck the GPU or the game. If instead you're doing video or photo work, you're going to want a reasonably fast CPU with more cores and at least something like an NVIDIA GTX 1650 Super or better. The best thing to do is to make a list of the programs that you use and see what the recommended specs are for those programs. I've got a roundup of my favorite CPU and GPU combos for 1080p, 1440p, and 4K gaming PC builds later in the video. Let's talk about motherboards. We've done a number of best motherboard videos for AMD Ryzen CPUs, as well as best Z690 motherboards for overclockable Intel 12th generation CPUs, and those videos are part of the How to Build a PC playlist in the video description below. Now, the motherboard is the thing that all the components plug into, and it allows them to talk to each other and work together. Motherboards are also specific both to the brand, so AMD has motherboards that only work with its CPUs, and Intel motherboards only work with Intel CPUs. And the motherboards themselves use something called a chipset, most of which are compatible only with certain CPU series. So for instance, a Z690 motherboard is an Intel chipset motherboard that will only work with 12th generation Intel processors, not Intel 10th or 11th generation. And an X570 motherboard is an AMD chipset motherboard that will work with Ryzen 3000 and 5000 CPUs. I'll leave a list of the motherboard chipsets and which CPU lineups they are compatible with in the links down in the video description. There are three common motherboard sizes. There's a full-size or ATX size motherboard, a half-size version called a micro ATX or MATX, and a very small version called an ITX motherboard. On the back of the motherboard will be the USB ports of varying speeds, audio output for the onboard sound, wired and wireless networking, and display outputs if you're not using a dedicated GPU. Motherboards also have either 2 or 4 slots for RAM, SATA connections for SATA storage drive, and at least 1 slot for an M.2 drive, and connections for system fans, RGB, and front panel PC case USB and audio ports. The motherboard also has an operating system called BIOS, which allows you to change the way the motherboard, memory, or other components run. One of the most important motherboard features is the power delivery on the motherboard, called the VRMs, a little half square around the CPU, which will often have a heatsink to avoid overheating under heavy use. You need to pay attention closely to these if you're using an 8-core CPU or greater. Then of course there's the PCIe Express slots, also called the PCIe slots. The top one is for the graphics card and is a by 16 slot, and they vary in size depending on how much bandwidth they have. Note that smaller add-in cards can still be used in the larger slots. Most modern motherboards use what is called PCIe 4.0 speed, and the Intel 12th generation and upcoming Ryzen 7000 CPUs use PCIe Gen 5 speed. However, most users currently do not benefit from the extra speed, so this isn't necessarily something builders should concern themselves with unless you do professional level work with a lot of super fast drives running a huge amount of data. One other feature to mention is onboard audio. All modern motherboards come with it, but you aren't always using it. If you plug in an analog audio device with a connector like this into the motherboard or the front panel of the PC case, you are using the onboard motherboard audio processing. If instead you plug in a connection like HDMI or USB, then you're using the digital signal to transfer the audio processing to a secondary device like a stereo receiver. The quality of the onboard audio can usually be tracked by looking at the audio codec. Audio codecs in the 800 series, so like the ALC 897 for instance, are entry level and they're fine to get going. If you want better audio, then look for audio codecs like the ALC 1200 or higher. If using a higher end audio codec, make sure to plug in your analog headphones into the front of the PC case to take advantage of their special features to improve headphone performance. RAM, also called memory, is what the system uses to temporarily store information it's using right now. Now, I did a whole video on the best RAM for Ryzen 5000, which goes into a lot of these concepts in great detail, and it's included in the How to Build a PC playlist in the video description. RAM comes in sticks that are called DIMMs, and the current generation of systems use DDR4 memory. Most common memory speeds are between 3000 and 3600. Note that the speed is technically not in megahertz, but it's such a widespread misconception that I don't really bother to correct it anymore. RAM also has a CAS latency, abbreviated CL or C with a number. Common CAS latencies for DDR4 are CL14, CL16, and CL18. One thing to note on memory is that most of the quoted memory speeds are actually overclocking profiles, either XMP or DOCP. So when you plug in your memory, go into the BIOS and activate the XMP or DOCP profile to get the full rated speed out of your memory. Intel 12th generation can use either DDR4 or the newer DDR5 memory, and the upcoming Ryzen 7000 CPUs will also use DDR5. At the time of filming, DDR5 is in short supply and pricing has been extremely high. Also, for the 12th generation Intel processors, there hasn't been any performance increase between DDR4 and DDR5, so we've been recommending using DDR4 with a compatible DDR4 motherboard. Memory is always best used in pairs of sticks, something known as dual channel, as just getting a single stick will heavily hurt performance and it's not recommended. How much memory you need depends on what you're doing, but a general rule of thumb is at least 16 gigabytes for gaming, streaming gameplay to a service like Twitch, or amateur video editing. And I'd recommend at least 32 gigabytes for professional level streaming or production workloads. And of course, RAM can come with RGB, which is just a lot of fun. Let's talk about storage. Now, storage comes in 3 types today. Hard disk drives, which are dying out and should be avoided as boot drives, and solid state drives or SSDs, which come either using a SATA connector like this or as an M.2 that plugs directly into the motherboard. I did a whole video on best SSDs for gaming that delves deep into these complex little devices, and it's part of the How to Build a PC playlist, so check that out for more in depth. Right now, we are recommending M.2 NVMe SSDs over the older SATA SSD versions, as they're now cheaper, much faster, and they don't really require any messing around with cables to connect. And given the current market pricing, it just doesn't make any sense to buy anything less than 500 gigabytes with 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte, and up to 4 terabyte models available. The best price to storage ratio tends right now to be between 1 and 2 terabytes in the US market. NVMe SSDs come in a variety of speeds, mostly PCIe Gen 3 and PCIe Gen 4. However, most applications, especially gaming, do not yet take advantage of even PCIe Gen 3 speeds, making PCIe Gen 4 SSDs a waste of money for most users. And remember, PCIe is backwards compatible, so you can always plug a PCIe Gen 3 drive into a motherboard with PCIe Gen 4 or even Gen 5, and it'll run just at the slower speed, which is still really fast. Let's talk about CPU coolers. Now, I did a very deep dive on CPU coolers in my best cooler for Ryzen 2022, as well as my best all-in-one liquid coolers video, which are part of the How to Build a PC playlist, so check those out for more detail. Basically, if your CPU overheats, it will throttle your performance, and that's bad! So you want to make sure to give it enough cooling. The more cores or more power it requires, I'm looking at you, i9-12900K, the more cooling it will require. You can do that with an air cooler, or an all-in-one liquid cooler, also called an AIO, or with a custom-built liquid loop cooler. If this is your first PC build or your first in a while, I recommend skipping a custom loop cooler and going straight for either an air cooler or an all-in-one liquid cooler. I have several good recommendations in the links in the video description. Note that some Ryzen and Intel CPUs come with included box coolers. Ryzen included coolers are usually sufficient, though I often recommend upgrading to at least a budget tower air cooler. The same goes for Intel 12th generation box coolers. It's okay to get you going, but other than the i3, I recommend upgrading it. For the 10th and 11th gen Intel CPUs, the older version of the Intel cooler is just e-waste, other than for the i3 CPUs. Let's talk about the PC case. It's not that complicated. Modern cases come with a glass or acrylic see-through side panel to show off your build. The front panel will have a mix of USB and audio jacks. If it has a front panel USB Type-C connector, you're going to want to ensure that your motherboard comes with the right header for it. You'll want to get the right size motherboard for your case. ATX cases will fit the 3 sizes we discussed, while micro ATX cases will not fit an ATX full-size motherboard. Check the compatible motherboards listed in the specs before you buy a case. PC cases provide airflow to remove the hot air and bring in cooler air from the outside. Mesh front panels are best, but unfortunately there are still quite a few cases with really bad airflow. PC cases will usually come with 1 or more included fans, though sometimes the quality can be disappointing. PC case fans commonly come in 120mm and 140mm sizes. So when buying additional fans, make sure they're going to fit in your case. How many fans do you need? For ATX size cases, I would recommend at least 2 to 3 intake and at least 1 exhaust fan, but the more the better. And RGB lighting makes fans fun. Of course, your PC needs power to its various components, and that's where the power supply unit, or PSU, is there for. I've got a whole video on how to size, evaluate, and buy the best PSU included in the How to Build a PC series in the video description. PSUs come in 2 main sizes, ATX, which is the most common, and SFX, which is for small form factor cases. Check to make sure you get a case and power supply of the correct sizing. Power supplies come in different wattages and different efficiency ratings called 80+, and range from a white rating to a bronze unit to a gold unit to a platinum unit. PSUs are actually quite complex, and I strongly recommend that you watch my PSU buying guide before making your final decision. One thing to note is that you can get custom power extension cables in black, white, or any color you can imagine. Just remember that these cables are there to extend the existing PSU cables, not to plug this directly into the PSU, because those connections are proprietary. Let's talk about the monitor. And of course, I've got a great video on them that I'll link in the video description, because it is important to get the right resolution and the right refresh rate monitor to go with your graphics card. The main resolutions are 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. Refresh rates range from 60 Hz or 60 FPS all the way up to 360 Hz, with most modern monitors now able to do 144 Hz. I strongly recommend using the DisplayPort cable connection from your GPU to the monitor, and getting one that at least has FreeSync, which will be compatible with both AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. Finally, we've got miscellaneous parts like fan and RGB controllers, Wi-Fi add-in cards, and USB adapters, video capture cards, and more. As a builder, it might help to use a fan, RGB, or combo RGB fan controller if you're adding in a lot of fans or RGB. If your motherboard doesn't come with Wi-Fi, I'd recommend getting a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth adapter, either a PCIe add-in card or a USB one. Be aware that some add-in Wi-Fi adapters don't have Bluetooth, which you'll need if you want to connect wireless Bluetooth devices like headphones. Of course, there's a lot more here, like Thunderbolt support, keyboards, mice, and so much more. So let me know down in the comments what you'd like us most to cover in the future. You're going to build the best gaming PC in 2022. What part should you pick first, and which one should you spend the biggest part of your PC build budget on? First off, the most important parts you're going to pick will be the CPU and the GPU. Given the wide range of budgets, it's hard to put a percentage on it, but I'd think about spending up to half of my budget on the GPU as a general rule. Here are my top CPU, GPU combos for PC building in 2022. If you're looking for the best budget 1080p gaming PC build, I'd choose the Intel i3 12100 or 12100F with a cheap B660 motherboard, 16GB of RAM, and a GPU like the NVIDIA RTX 3050 or 2060, or higher performance AMD Radeon RX 6600. Check out our best budget gaming builds video for more. For 1080p gaming at high FPS, I'd upgrade the CPU to either a Ryzen 5600 with an AMD B550 motherboard or an i5 12400 or 12400F, and look to get a Radeon RX 6600, 6600 XT, or NVIDIA RTX 3060. If you're looking for the best 1440p gaming PC build, I'd stay with those same CPUs, but go with a bigger GPU in the Radeon RX 6700 XT or RX 6800, or the NVIDIA RTX 3060 Ti or 3070. And we have PC build videos on the channel for both the Ryzen 5600 as well as the i5 12400, so check those out. And finally, for a 4K gaming PC build, I'd look to upgrade the CPU to an AMD Ryzen 5800X, maybe even the 5800X 3D, or an Intel i5 12600K or 12700K, and get an RTX 3080, 3080 Ti, 3090, or an AMD Radeon 6800 XT or 6900 XT. If you're looking for the best PC build for streaming in 2022, just take the gaming PC build, get 32 gigabytes of memory instead, add more storage, and that should get you started. If you're someone looking for creative production work, then the best PC build 2022 is slightly different for you. You're going to want to first start off considering the recommended specs for the software that you use. Now, more than likely, you're going to want to prioritize getting a modern CPU with at least 8 cores and at least 32 gigabytes of memory and a sufficient GPU for your work. Then you're going to want to ensure that you're going to have enough storage for your work products, and you probably need a lot of it. Unless we do a lot of our heavy data transfer in our work, we probably want to go with a PCIe Gen 3 prosumer level drive and emphasize total amount of space rather than going for blistering speeds with a PCIe Gen 4 SSD. Cooling is always important, but the more you're doing long duration multi-core workloads, the more you're going to want a very capable CPU cooler and good case airflow so your workspace doesn't sound like you're testing a jet engine. In terms of whether to go AMD or Intel, the great news is right now that both are extremely competitive in 2022 for the best gaming PC build or the best PC build for creators. For gaming graphics cards, both AMD and NVIDIA provide excellent experiences for both straight gaming as well as streaming gameplay. If you get value out of the video, give it a like. It makes a huge difference, especially to this guy right here. And of course, subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release cool content. And if you're looking for the How to Build a PC playlist and you want to dive deeper, it's right here. Check it out, start getting into it. You can do this. Anybody can build a PC in 2022, and we'll catch you on the next one.